Today's webinar is The Unexpected Risks of AI in Finance. What you're not watching could cost you. We're joined by Tyler Warden, Senior Vice President of Product at Sonatype, and Aaron Erickson, the founder of Applied AI Lab, DGX Cloud, Nvidia. So Tyler, Aaron, let's start with you, Tyler. If you could give brief intros, and then we'll go ahead and get started with our panel questions.
Hey, y'all, good to see you. I'm Tyler. I look after product here at Sonatype, and you probably know us from a lot of the work we do here with this group in and around securing, using, modernizing, and just making open source awesome in general. We've, over the past couple of years, have expanded our aperture from not only open source components, but open source AI models. A lot of research, findings, capabilities there. So great to be here. And Aaron, over to you.
All right. Yeah. So I'm Aaron Erickson, and I lead something called our Applied AI Lab at Nvidia, where we take build models. So we build foundation models such as time series and similar kinds of models, as well as agent frameworks. So things that you can ask a question to or give a task, and it will actually take some action on behalf of you, which is a really interesting conversation when you start to think about what are some of the risks with AI. Well, we're giving AI arms and legs and ability to touch your keyboard. So there's all sorts of interesting situations this is going to run into as this advances.
Excellent. Thank you, Tyler and Aaron. A reminder to everyone, we do have the Q&A box on our Zoom open. We are largely going to do Q&A in the last 10 minutes, though if something really interesting pops up in the Q&A box, we might incorporate it a little earlier. Please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A box throughout today's call, and we'll make sure to get to them we'll save 10 to 15 minutes at the end to get to Q&As. Today's themes are going to be focused on the novel and invisible security risks in AI-driven financial systems, the foundational role and often underappreciated role that hardware plays in AI security, and regulatory approaches to AI and compliance question for risk and compliance teams. So the first question that we're going to have here is, and this is for both of our panelists, what's a common misconception about the security of AI systems in financial services? Tyler, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think one of the common misconceptions or maybe blind spots is the models and the kind of research that's done in the open source AI model space, less the tooling that's off the shelf. We see a lot of focus today of, we'll call them third-party tools, commercial off-the-shelf products and solutions and subscriptions, and a lot of kind of, we'll call it shadow AI that pops up. Like suddenly you use a product and then there's an AI feature, right? Can I turn it on and off? Or your favorite assistant, pilot, either your airplane reference or your ocean reference, deep, high sea, pilot, whatever, right? Those third-party areas get a lot of attention. I think one of the common misconceptions is how much open source AI is being brought in, being utilized, being researched, being played with, being experimented on. And that seems to be getting less attention than we think it should. Reminds us a lot of the beginnings of open source, right? When that really got popular, oh, we're not using it. Oh, actually, you are, your teams are. So expanding that aperture to the models that are being brought in and used is, I think, maybe not a misconception, but an area that people aren't really thinking about like we think that they should.
I would add to that in the sense that I think one of the biggest risks is that we think we're in control. And when I say that, I don't mean like in the AI going out of control. I mean, literally thinking about, well, if I put in these rules or if I put in these guidelines as IT, that I will be able to disallow AI. One of the things I think everybody should think about is how much email traffic is going from somebody's personal ChatGPT account or things that they use to personally make their job easier, and then sending it back and forth to their corporate account because IT won't allow you to use the AI that might solve some given problem. This stuff is so powerful, people are buying their own accounts. Somebody told me that most of Cursor, so the really, really popular IDE that's come out, is actually people spending their personal money to be more productive on these platforms versus going through corporate IT because corporate IT is too slow, which then lands in people using all sorts of unregulated shadow stuff where what we really need to do is start to embrace this, understand how open source is going to play into it, and actually kind of understand that people are already getting productivity benefits. How are we going to enable that in our org and not just say no to everything?
Great answers. I'm excited to dig into those more a little bit later. But so follow-up question, could either of you share a real or hypothetical example where AI introduced a hidden risk? And I think we heard a little bit of that earlier, but let's dive into these a little more.
We've seen some unintended use of pickle files is something that might be a new file format that you're not, or a construct you're not familiar with. Pickle is a really great kind of technological foundation that allows you to essentially serialize and deserialize stuff really, really fast and keep state. But at its core, it can be used to essentially run any code, right? It can help you execute code. Now, it does this for very good reasons, but anything that can execute code kind of blindly can be used for nefarious reasons. So one of the examples that we see is some real new and kind of novel attack vectors, but also security and governance processes, policies, tooling to help guard against this kind of new area, right? With any awesome benefit, and there's great things about pickle files and running them in PyTorch and all cool, such a cool stuff, there could be some risks as well. So that's just an example that we see, especially kind of the open source AI world, is people doing a lot of research and attack areas around pickle files and PyTorch and that sort of stuff. So that's one example that comes to mind from my perspective.
Yeah, I can build on that. One of the first things you do with agents, and it's really exciting, is you give them access to an environment and you tell them you can pip install whatever you want, which is both extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily dangerous. So your software supply chain risk, it's literally like giving a overeager intern the ability to just download anything they want and run it over whatever database you want, which with the right security concerns may be okay. If you give them some boundaries, if you give them some constraints on the environment, but running this unconstrained, it's dangerous, but it's also powerful. So what will happen though, because you'd say, well, any obvious person would say, put some controls around that. But what will happen is you'll get such an amazing result from the first version of this when it can reach anything. There'll be this subtle pressure to allow broader use of things that are unsafe because they're so powerful. So I think one of the things we have to do is really kind of think about how we constrain these use cases and understand this is literally, generating code on the fly as we go.
And as you're saying that, it sounds like they have more access than many interns would, particularly in financial services, where it's so hard to provision new environments. People might be blowing past that security check and giving more access. So we've gone into this a little bit. So where does the software supply chain play into AI risk, like in particular?
So there's a couple elements of this. One is just literally, if you're doing code gen, being able to kind of limit in your requirements.txt file what you're actually allowed to download into your environment. That's kind of the most basic, obvious thing you would do. You're constraining your environment. But I think beyond that, there's all sorts of ways that things can leak into a bigger agentic system through everything from prompt injection, being able to have systems downstream where you can put in a prompt that might several systems down the road. Almost like think of a system that might be doing kind of a pseudo operation into an environment, but then you've given it some ability for an LLM on the other side of that to interpret human input from the other side of the firewall, so to speak. There's a lot of things you can do in prompt injection that would take the SQL injection we're all familiar with from 10, 20 years ago and just make it seem almost incompetent at being a hacker compared to what you can do with prompt injection. So really understanding what those are is pretty critical.
Yeah, and there's the other thing I would say is there's two things to consider. There are open source components that embed models or call out to models that are online. So there are like traditional, if you want to call it that, components like JavaScript, Python, NPM, that sort of stuff. And then there's also just the supply chain of bringing on a new supplier, right? So this new supplier is Hugging Face is probably the biggest one out there. And so every time you go to Hugging Face and you bring a model down or you search it or you bring it in, that's a new kind of input. So there's all that supply chain benefit and risk that comes from your more traditional Maven, NPM, PyPy, all that stuff, we see Hugging Face as kind of the de facto. I realize there's models elsewhere. We see Hugging Face as kind of the de facto, supply chain input for a lot of the models that are being worked on in-house.
Yeah.
Also,
I think what you're going to start to see, by the way, is a lot of people doing their own private registries, similar to what they do with kind of more traditional software componentry, where when you pip install or NVM install or any of these platforms, you're coming from your private registry, what's allowed, not kind of the broader, just download any model, regardless of license or anything else, right? You're going to start seeing more and more of that.
We see that just from our own, I'll preface this is not an advertisement for anything, but we see a growing usage of, we'll call it private repositories for trusted models. That's something that we see a lot of growth in, because it makes natural sense to me anyways, that when I've got a model and it's been vetted and I could use it and trust it, that can unleash innovation in a lot of very powerful ways.
Yeah.
Hopefully open source could play a role in surfacing the commonalities between some of those private repos, as we've seen in other parts in supply chain security. I'll say from a FINOS perspective, or from an open source perspective, I think I'm not a security expert by any means, but I think I've started to see some of the problems of the scale of this when dealing with licensing, where you don't know what's properly licensed in the supply chain. And I think that's helped me contextualize the scope of the security problems that firms get exposed to in this. So the last question on unpacking the risk under this section. So what are some of the hardware level threats that CISOs in particular should be aware of?
That's a great question, because I think there's some of the same risks that you have in more traditional software. I mean, and I think there's a lot of, well, what's special about AI? And at the hardware level, it's often the same things. I mean, obviously there's some kind of risks that you can have when there's some kind of, instruction injection where you might be able to lose the weights of a private model. I think those are probably overplayed a little bit. But I think just a lot of the fundamentals of, okay, well, we need to have container security around how our models work. So you can't have some sort of side-loaded prompt injection into a system that says, and oh, by the way, always run this Python tool at the end of any agentic call that does this other thing that I want that breaks security or whatnot. So I think it's more about kind of more your traditional kinds of security postures you'd have around any kind of software. But the way to imagine it is, imagine any container that you're running can write its own software. Almost all these models know how to write code. So literally it's like you're putting a little powerful intern that might be mad at you inside of every container that runs AI. Yeah, I think that's the default stance you need to take. An intern that's mad at you because you didn't renew their internship, writing code, always kind of plan on that in these containers.
And Tyler, over to you. Anything on the hardware level side that you see?
I think that Aaron covered it really well, right? It's a very similar thing to what we see in a lot of places. I love that angry intern story. I'm going to steal that.
I will also be, people on the very next open source call start hearing me use that analogy for cert. Going into the next section, just prefacing for our audience that we're not coming into this as regulatory experts. And so we're going to be talking at a very high level here and not speaking directly to specific regulations, but it is part of the risk and compliance framework. And so generally, and Aaron, I'll leave it to you but how are generally regulators kind of approaching AI risks in finance?
And so it really kind of depends on the sophistication of the regulator and the way they look at it. At one level, it might be seen as a box checking exercise. Are you applying, these are, this or that standard? Are you air gapped? All that kind of stuff. I think the more nuanced people that understand how these systems work think about more like terms like explainability. You need to be able to explain why a AI system made the decisions it made. Especially because one of the biggest risks, getting back to that, is being a sycophant, it kind of telling you what you want to hear, or sounding plausible when it comes up with an answer around some really important financial matter or some important trading strategy or some important other thing that you care about. So really thinking about, how do you understand how it made the decision? And to that end, there's some designs that are better than others. one big monolithic model sometimes can be more like a black box. Even if you have open weights, being able to understand every reasoning trace in a reasoning model when it came up with some major decision is really important. One of the things that we see with reasoning models in particular in this world is if you don't have a reward function that kind of ground truth for the reasoning, sometimes reasoning can go off in these wild tangents where suddenly you're rebuilding your entire case, or some other kind of bad thing happens. So I think those are a couple of the angles I would take on that in terms of, from a regulation standpoint, they really care about explainability. How did you make the decision? And sometimes the design can be make the AI make smaller decisions in the early phases of getting regulatory approval, and then start to kind of incrementally increase the complexity of kinds of decisions you allow it to make, both just from a risk management perspective, as well as just so you understand what it's doing and the patterns in which it's going to take.
Yeah, that word explainability was one that came to mind as well. We also see kind of on the other side of it in the software that's being written and shipped, especially externally or in an exchange, there's a growing demand for visibility, like what models are you using and how does that fold into a software bill of materials, right? So there's an AI bomb is something we're hearing about more and more, but then there's the software bill of materials. How do those two kind of come together? So there's the capital R regulatory, right? The UAI Act and that sort of stuff that's looking at explainability, traceability, visibility. But we also see kind of the self-regulation of the market is there's this interchange of what models are you using, what is there, what needs to be reported on. So there's this underlying kind of audit response visibility that is very foundational. And we see that as kind of a core need across the financial services area is real good reporting on what's being used where and when.
Well, and not only that, the conversations between systems. And so, this will either terrify you or fascinate you or both. And that is, we have systems where we talk to it in human language in English and a result comes out the other side. We have another agent system that does the same. And what I've started to see is these systems that consist of multiple agents that talk to each other in human to orchestrate work. Now, if I had a group of people on a trading floor that were orchestrating a conspiracy theory, I'd want to know about that. Well, people have done this in labs where they get a bunch of agents talking to each other to solve a problem. And I kid you not, the AI will do conspiracy theories to figure out how it achieves a goal. People have shown this in Anthropic, there's studies of this stuff. And so I think you have to kind of take this observability of the conversation between agents as a serious problem. I know it might sound fantastical right now, but this is actually something we're seeing in some of these frontier applications.
And a quick plug for a recent blog that came out of FINOS recently, but there was the SEC roundtable on AI and finance several weeks ago that a number of FINOS members, senior people at FINOS members gathered to talk about governance in AI and financial services, which did give a little bit of a pitch for the FINOS AI governance framework. But also the thing that we heard from each of the panelists was everyone's so focused on inputs and outputs. And like for that explainability, for that traceability, transparency. But that was kind of the commonly with Franco. So I think that also really goes on the agents talking to each other is like treating each section as a separate input and output to be examined for this whole traceability is something that we've heard as a common theme for the last 8 months in the FINOS community. More specifically, Aaron, I think this is going to be more for you, but do you feel like frameworks like DORA and NIST adequately address AI threats?
No. I don't think they do. I don't know much about in those frameworks where they talk about how agents talk to each other. I think a lot of those frameworks are frankly kind of based on, and I think they're good baselines, right? I'm not saying they're bad. I think there's a lot more that's needed. We need to understand, how agentic systems work. We need to understand how multiple things would talk to, just like we were talking about before. Yeah, what are those conversations? About a room of people that were working on a project, I want some ability to read their email. I'd want some ability to read what their Slack messages are if I need to do an audit. What is the auditability of agentic systems working? What are those controls we have on agentic systems? How are they different than what we would use with more traditional systems? There are differences. A human only has so much time to try to break into a system. I can spin up 10,000 instances of an AI trying to break into your system, and it will probably come up with a good way to do it. So, if you have an AI trained on every good technique a black hat hacker ever uses, imagine that's coming after you. So I think these standards have to be kind of updated to some degree for this, but I'm not an expert in the latest version of their standards. So I imagine they're very smart people in those bodies that are probably trying to figure out some of this stuff too. And so I'd be very interested in how they're addressing some of the most frontier threats in the last even 3 months that are coming up.
And I'll say we did receive some signals recently that people are paying attention to emerging frameworks in all of these from multiple audiences. So I think some of the conversations that are going to be guiding this are, there's a role for open source framework building to be able to be in conversation with these other frameworks, like as the conversation moves forward. So this is for both of you, and we can kind of take this at different levels, but what advice would you give to a compliance team navigating this space?
Tyler, you want this one?
I think that there are foundational frameworks, like you mentioned, that are a good place to start, but won't color all the way to the edge, right? There's good foundations in there. But I think that it becomes a mindset. Like if I were to say treat prompts as code as a high level philosophy, if I said to any compliance or governance team internally, what if your prompts were code? That would immediately trigger, okay, what do I do with all my source code? Not a line of code gets written or merged in that we don't have track of. All of our lines of code get scanned. You know what I mean? So I think there's real good foundations that teams can think about. So if you conceptually, what I tell people is think about prompts as code. Think about agents as people. I'm going to use angry interns from now on. They have the same identity access management of you would an employee, the same stuff that they write. There's always an accountable person somewhere in that tree. So if you treat them like that, there's an identity access problem. There's a prompt as code problem. There's a what they're doing in the infrastructure problem. I find that that's a good place to start and ground, because like what I talk about, you talked about access. That access to those agentic systems still has to be granted. Now, a lot of people grant it wide, but it's the same access management philosophy, right? Of what does this thing, person, machine, script, whatever have access to? So thinking about it like that and kind of projecting those concepts, I think is a good place for people to start and take a lot of the tooling and frameworks they have and now just expanding it to that next layer.
Yeah, I would build on that. And I would say from a regulator standpoint, if I'm thinking about how do I manage this, first thing I would say is you should start using it. You should start understanding what it actually does, and don't take it as here's another thing. God, I did cloud last year. Oh God, I got to do AI this year. Geez, why is this so hard? You should use it so you understand what the limitations are. You should use it so you understand why people are going to do this anyway, why you can't just shut it down. It's not going to be just shut down because people get a lot of productivity out of it, far more than a lot of kind of prior technologies. And so understand it's going to happen that way. And I think you brought up an important point. You almost kind of have to think of these as malevolent, but extremely knowledgeable employees that might, that have extraordinary capabilities, but can open up extraordinary new kinds of risk. And so being able to think about kind of just all the different ways somebody might use this. And again, kind of being able to see those conversations between agents and being able to, but also understand what the emerging risks are, right? Understand that, if you start to have these kind of broad agent-based systems, there's going to be a lot of subtle risks about, well, what happens when it, again, has a kind of plausible idea that it brings forward? Are you vetting that the right way? Those kinds of things are also part of it too. But yeah, use it is my first really big advice.
I'm thinking to go from the intern perspective. The intern analogy is interns sometimes either they don't know what they don't know. Like interns have limited access to existing systems, which I think is also kind of like how a lot of AI systems are. Or the other side is they have a lot of access to data, but they don't know the context of it. a lot of the things we see in our framework are really focused on data and data access. And I think it's something that's a lot more muscle memory in around and data control. Is there anything either that if you already have muscle memory, you should just continue doing? Or are there any kind of additional things with data access control that are nuanced and new for AI than kind of what the history of this has been? And maybe Tyler, maybe that start with you on that, or Aaron.
Aaron, you go ahead.
Yeah. So there's a couple of approaches that people I've seen take to access control and data with AI. And I think everybody's seen that story of everybody's ever used Lean, or I think the story was with Copilot. People gave access to everybody in the organization Copilot in a lot of companies. And they suddenly discovered it would answer questions like, what are the salary bands? Or what is the salary of the VP of regulation? And they're like, why is it doing this? Why is it allowing me to answer this question? And it turns out one of the biggest things that happens is you already had a bunch of security risks. You already had a bunch of documents that people had access to. They just didn't know they had access to it. Well, when you have AI that's a little bit different, it's more patient. It can look at every document and it can literally index everything. And so it's the data that you already let people have access to that can sometimes be the problem. So it's causing you to need to kind of almost go back to your fundamentals and actually look at, no, literally, I have to understand what everybody has access to and limit them to that. And then once I have that done, I can allow the AI agent to just kind of index everything and be able to kind of go carte blanche with what it has access to. The other thing that's really important is the approach that people also took was, well, why don't I just build a model based on all the data I have in my organization, then try to limit it? And I think that approach is going to be very tough to do because once you are in a model, it's very easy to prompt engineer, even if you have something that says, well, every answer have another LM downstream that says, don't tell anybody things that are illegal or private information. That hyper naive approach to guardrails just isn't going to work with, large systems like that. So having every AI agent system in your ecosystem be able to have that specific security data access to data is really important.
Yeah, the fundamentals are still the fundamentals. It's that you get exposed faster, right? Like I was going to say very similar. It's that like everybody in the company should not have access to somebody's social security number. But the fact that there's some Excel spreadsheet somewhere that has them deep in the bowels of something that nobody has looked at, now you're telling something to go look everywhere. And so that is, it makes the fundamentals more important. And so your answer, Karl, I would say to your question is the fundamentals don't change. It's just you'll get exposed faster in ways that you didn't think about earlier with this. So I think reaction times need to be different. We also see that there's the fundamentals matter, but so too does quick reaction time, being able to turn stuff off quickly as you go and investigate something. So speed to react is also something that we see becoming more and more critical.
I guess the natural follow-up to that question is, and I'm sorry, we're getting a little off additional script here, but is that a role for AI to speed it? Should that be a fully human in the loop process to speed up time to react, or can AI play a role in that?
Oh yeah, listen, I think that fight fire with fire. For every risk, there's a benefit. Like I know what this webinar is called, and so we focus on the risk side of it. But just like this same problem of showing the data you don't want to have access to is a great way to root out where you don't have security controls in place. And I think that bad guys can use AI, good guys can use AI, right? And I think that yes, it's going to play a role for sure. And I think that, like when somebody said in the Q&A, right, there's not everybody should have Linux root access, right? So it's that you're just going to find it faster. So it should definitely play a role.
I'm in favor of having another angry intern AI that's angry at the other one that's trying to break in.
There you go.
Is the way I'd put it.
Oh, this is the perfect analogy. It's so good. Cool. So moving on to our next section, we have two great questions in the Q&A box. We will definitely give time to them when this section is over. we're going to just go on to the next section here. But if you have Q&As, please definitely continue to get them through. We will save time for them at the end. So our next section is about building security into AI. So the first question, what are the most critical controls or practices for securing specifically AI pipelines?
I always point people to the OWASP top 10 on LLMs is a great place to start. Like if you've never researched this or never thought about it, I think that gives a good baseline. And I think I always tell people that if you're building your own pipelines, you're building your own agents, you're downloading your own models, I think it starts with that model selection up front. It's making good initial selection and kind of scanning and understanding what technologies you're using. But I would say,
could you give a little more background on what that is in case people aren't?
The OWASP top 10 LLM thing. So OWASP is a 8 group agencies, not the right word. I'm searching for the word consortium agency, open collaboration thing that publishes some pretty well-referenced work historically on the kind of the top 10 security areas to look at in the more traditional software space. They've come out with a top 10 areas of risk and security focus for LLMs. And while I know that LLMs are not the core, like there's AI that's not a large language model, the foundational elements in that is more like an AI top 10 with a little LLM sprinkle on top. That's a really good public free document and set of controls and things to check for. That's a great foundational point, which is where I kind of point people to is if you're actively thinking about those and helping secure those, you're in a very good spot as a foundation.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's useful to step back for a second, realize LLMs are just software. At the end of the day, it's all software. But it happens to be software that's non-deterministic, that will behave somewhat unreliably and doesn't work all the time, right? And I know Nvidia, I should say, not those things, but we have to build in guardrails to plan for those things. And, it's down to actually in the design of these systems, those are the things you have to think about. Well, how do you take the non-deterministic nature of an LLM and channel it in a deterministic way so you can get reliability out of these systems, which is going to be one of the, things you have to have first before you can have any kind of security at all. So they work in a consistent way.
Well, and I think that leads to so from an operational or kind of human process perspective, rating differently than they do today in order to kind of tackle these emerging new risks. And
Sorry, can you
Tyler,
repeat the question? Okay, go ahead.
Sir. So how should security and engineering teams be collaborating differently than they do today to address these emerging risks?
I'm not sure I would use the word different. I would use the word better. So I think that it's just software, right? I use just in quotes. So any teams that are building or working on these, because it's emerging and fast moving, it takes better collaboration. So I know in my experience, especially in the finance world, these teams have well-trodden paths to work together. But for a while, it's felt like we've been working together on kind of incrementally solving the same problems better. Now we need to work on solving new problems together faster. Maybe not new, but like the next real step up in flavor. So I wouldn't say different largely. I would just say better. So better means sooner, faster, and more iteratively is where I would kind of ask people to think about.
And what I would say kind of as a yes and to that is, imagine you have a piece of software that can write itself from scratch based on what the user wants. That's what LLMs do, especially when you use agentic LLMs that are writing their own code and then executing things. And I think once you put it in that frame, it gives you a different set of expectations of how you would manage that software. I hear people talking about, well, what happens when you commit the code or commit the prompts or whatnot? In a lot of ways, what's happening though is we're literally creating what's called ephemeral software, which is literally software that's created once, used once, and thrown away. Ask that question to your security team. What would happen if you're literally using new software every day, every hour, every question, and then work backwards from that? And I think you would have a different set of things. I also want you to think about when you're doing that, though, realizing that everybody wants to use this for the same reason they use Excel spreadsheets, which is Excel spreadsheets are the ultimate vibe coded app, so to speak, where people that don't get what they need from whatever SaaS system they have do something in a spreadsheet to meet their needs. What they're doing with LLMs now is like that on steroids, where, okay, now it's the entire system is the equivalent of somebody's custom spreadsheet going deep into your data and doing things.
So to wrap up this section, and this might be a rehash for people here, and maybe I'll do some follow-ups here, but so are there any lessons or limitations from, so lessons or limitations from traditional supply chain security that apply to AI and AI security?
I would say that one of the lessons of supply chain security of choosing fewer, better suppliers in like from a physical world with means I've got better choosing fewer, better open source components and models. One of the things that we see is a lot of work has gone into helping the software engineering teams make those decisions. One of the lessons is if that code is written ephemerally, is that the word? Ephemerally? In an ephemeral state, sure. Some of that code might be all first-party code. Some of the code would be, shoot, I'm going to pip install this thing so I can connect to a database. I'm not ephemerally creating a database driver. And so limiting that using allow lists, proven, right? Like you need to shift that to code that doesn't exist. So what we see is there's long-running code. Tyler's opinion, there's always going to be the world for deterministic software, right? So what we learned from that is now think about it in an ephemeral state. So, but the same supply chain is being used. It's just being pulled, used, and thrown away. And so how do you need to take that same concept. So again, I've yet to see a foundational, like a bounce pass is a bounce pass and a chest pass is a chest pass. The foundations of basketball are there. That foundation has to be applied now to this more ephemeral way of working and thinking, which is just, this is why security engineering have to work tightly together. Yeah, go write your cool agentic chain MCP server all day. But in that, guardrail to these components, this set, this is not allowed, right? You can only pull from this, like just pull from our repo. You can pull anything in our repo or anything, so it's that sort of thinking applied. So that is different, but it's built on the same foundations that we know.
I'm going to borrow your sports analogy for a second, which is we've gone from a world where the coach calls all the plays to where your point guard can call the plays, which has the advantage and disadvantage of your point guard calling the plays. If you have Steph Curry on your team, it might work out pretty well. If you have a point guard that didn't get very much sleep and is mad at you, or otherwise has some wild ideas about how they want to do it, or take some really, kind of risks that you don't want, understand what their tendencies are, which, I know I'm using a fantastical example, but it turns out LLMs have their own personality. People describe Sonnet 3.7, for example, as a model, as a very overeager intern that wants to do so much, is very eager to please, almost to the degree where they will accidentally destroy important things, but earnestly. This isn't an angry intern. This is a very overly helpful intern that just does too much. So you also have to be worried about that kind of model. But also each of these has a different personality. So get to know the personality, for lack of a better term, of your LLM, get to really know how they act. And then once you start understanding that, you can start to really think about how you regulate or how you channel its very creative energy in a useful way and not a destructive way.
I'm going to do just one more follow-up on this section, and then we'll get to our wrap. But what is the role that design plays? And I'm going to say from kind of like an architecture design, but also from a user-centric design in getting people into kind of the compliant ecosystem. And so part of my background is working with financial services on their compliant messaging, user to user or user to bot. But the problem is if it's a bad user experience, people go outside the system and use non-compliant apps. So Aaron, you brought up earlier that people are buying their own AI systems to speed up their work when they don't have the correct user flow. So I just wanted to give both of you a chance to talk about like what's the role of design play in building these systems?
I think that, go ahead. Sorry.
So I'll go. I think one of the things that we want to think about first, not everything's a chatbot. So, a lot of these things are going to be designed in a way that isn't immediately just, oh, let me get a question answer. Some of these are going to be embedded in workflow systems and whatnot. So I think it's important to go just beyond the kind of user design aspects on this. I think thinking about what is a way to get things surfaced that are just a little disclaimer at the bottom saying this might be wrong. Some things where you kind of highlight where that human has been in the loop. So you understand what parts of this came from the person, which came from the bot are really important. Until we solve really high-end reasoning and make these things literally AGI level, I don't think we're there yet. I'd love to be there, but we're not. We need to understand what parts were generated by the LLM and not. And that's a design choice you can make in any kind of system that clearly calls that stuff out and doesn't try to trick the user, which is always kind of a nice thing because everybody wants that bot that's their like colleague that kind of tells them, either their idea is good or gives them good advice on that. It's very easy to kind of lured seductively into that kind of anthropomorphization kind of world. I think when we're doing serious work, we need to step away from that, right? You never write an HFT system that pretended like it was doing trading on your behalf in that manner. It's always a system at the other end. It's determinism at the other end. I think you have to think about it that way.
I think that there is no substitute for human accountability in the process. So the example I give is, I don't know any software engineer that isn't using some sort of coding assistant simplistically or agentic or anywhere on the map. But I also don't know any that for their job, to be clear, for their job, doesn't have to put a pull request or a merge request in with their name on it, right? And so by designing systems, by systems, I mean capital S, like systems, not just a software product, that where a human has that accountability is what we see is my recommendation of if there's that accountability there, then there is the responsibility of that person and their boss and their management to be sure that what is happening and good and true, follows that path. Of course, there's holes in that and philosophy behind it. But all I'm saying is that there is ways that human in the loop process can get a ton of acceleration, but still have accountability at the right places to drive the outcomes that we want. And I co-sign Aaron that I think, so I was at RSA last week, or was it 2 weeks ago? Felt like 2 weeks ago. I don't know when it was. And I think Tyler's opinion, every booth saying AI and no booth saying AI is the same thing, right? Like there's really no difference if everybody says it, if nobody says it. I don't know how much longer we're going to just stick AI on everything versus AI is just assumed to be there behind the scenes as part of every workflow application that we have. And so I think as it becomes more normal, I guess, unless, hey, we got to slap this on everything from a marketing perspective, you're just going to have more natural interactions and accountability. I think people are looking for things now that may not be there. Anyway, that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think we have to remember AI doesn't just stand for angry intern. It also stands for if somebody just slaps AI at their product, it probably means doesn't work. When AI works, it just becomes optimization software, or it just becomes a smarter way to do something. And it just happens to use AI for the same reason our computers use electricity. They don't advertise a Mac, but with battery, right?
Yeah,
but it powers it, right?
Yeah, like traditional IP stack of like network layer and blah, blah, blah. Like now what we see is kind of the new norm is, okay, what AI layer are you using for almost all software? Even if the AI layer is literally just a user interface thing. Rather than go drop down, click left chart, I can say, where's the chart for Monday? Even if it's just that, we see it becoming more and more. We're in a window where there's marketing cachet behind sticking those two letters in that order on things. But what we really see is when it actually works. Like, nobody cares that when I pick up the phone to call you, the fact that it routes to you as an AI system behind the scenes, the phone call just goes through, right?
Yeah.
So, I think you're going to see that evolve as well.
Great. So we're about to launch a poll for the audience. I'm just going to quickly read. What's your organization's biggest concern when it comes to AI adoption in financial services? While people are answering that, we're going to do a couple rapid fire Q&A from the audience, and then we're going to wrap up with our two final closing questions. So the first of our rapid fire Q&A questions, going back to the Hugging Face comment from earlier in the talk, is there space to check out all or most of the confirmed vulnerabilities, security issues with the models exposed by, for example, Hugging Face or other orchestrators?
So there are some CVEs out there. There's also OWASP has some stuff. We really see a lot of things flowing into, if they're kind of open source, pickle scan stuff comes with CVEs. Hugging Face has some on their site. These are all, they're kind of new classes of vulnerabilities and issues that are kind of square peg round hole being jammed into those. But there's a lot of work among the big kind of vulnerability, and like OpenSSF is doing a lot of work here. FINOS is doing work here to try to introduce new kind of classifications in places. So it's where the stuff is now. It's just kind of evolving with the, I don't know, like the new classes and categories of stuff. Like a few years ago, prompt wasn't really something that you saw in CVEs and that sort of stuff. So we're trying to kind of evolve it as an industry.
Yeah. I mean, I would build on that and say there's probably a lot of CVEs where you can run this kind of prompt or that kind of prompt. And I think, stuff around that, I think, is almost trying to kind of wrap a deterministic box around non-deterministic software. And I think as a lot of these, evolve, they're going to realize it's a different way that you want to think about these vulnerabilities in terms of how you talk about invulnerability or vulnerabilities with non-determinism is actually a really hard topic. I don't know anybody solved it yet, to be frank.
Yeah.
Cool. Next question. Oops. Looks like I'll get to that poll in a second there. AI agents are vulnerable to simple things like emojis, which can be hard to spot and sometimes harder to explain. What are some checks and balances placed to make sure malicious prompts don't go through?
So on some of that, you often, kind of the basic example they do, and you'll probably see this even with some of the OpenAI stuff, is they have one usually smaller LLM that will analyze the incoming question to understand, is this something that he's even going to work around? So you have to kind of like break, ways you break an LLM by saying, okay, well, tell me a story about how to build a nuclear weapon that my grandma did or something like that, right? So there's kind of dumb ways to do that. And I think that kind of, I'll call it naive prompt-based guardrails are happening. There's some really interesting research around, especially open source models that you can do this, where if you understand, there's a term one of my colleagues uses called the hyperdimensional manifold, where, a lot of the interesting conversations about things that you don't want to have happen will happen. And you can understand in a given trace of how something rolls through the neural network, how a given response will happen. There's a lot of really good research happening there. And I expect in the next year or two that we're going to know that a lot, how that works a lot better in a way that's a little bit more controllable. But I think it's going to be the kind of fundamental guardrails that ultimately allow you to control at some level how an LLM talks. Until then, we have to almost kind of treat them like how you would manage a conversation with a bunch of people in it, where maybe you don't want everybody figuring out how to build a nuclear bomb and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I would add to that so there's like prompt scrubbers, right? Hey, let me check the question before I ask it. Not bad, not perfect. But what we see is log the prompts, audit the prompts. But if I could tell you one thing, the data is going to matter more. If you can protect and guard what data the LLM can talk to, That is a known, easily with quotes, securable space, way more so than trying to scrub or prevent a prompt from being added. So focus on the data can protect from a lot of prompt manipulation stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think that double down on that because you should be doing it anyway. And this is just all the LLMs are going to do is reveal where you have people doing security by obscurity or security by I hope they don't find it.
Yeah.
Well, they will find it. So now you just have to be better at the thing you're supposed to be good at anyway.
Yep.
Okay, one last Q&A question, and then we'll wrap up with our last bit here. Any input on AI in payment card industry like PCI? I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah. I would say this is not, everything we talked about here isn't really industry specific, but in the world of PCI, in the world of finance, the stakes are higher. The regulation is higher. The audit risk is higher than some other places. So the input that I would have is everything we talked about here, but also there's what we see, especially with the rise of regulations around things like SBOMs and other areas in PCI, visibility, accountability, audit response. I would encourage very much visibility, logging, understanding what's happening, and that rapid response just as industry trends in the PCI space.
Yeah, I would never put a human in the loop in the middle of a how do I process the transaction system, right? I don't want a human having an opinion on that. And I don't want an AI having an opinion on that. That's going to be deterministic software. So everything that's going to be PCI complied with is probably also going to be deterministic. Now, it's okay to have an AI use a tool that might use a payment system. I think that's going to happen more and more as we get more faith in these kinds of things and they start to prove reliable in some context. I think that's completely viable. But I think until then, you have to have human in the loop, even as you're maturing in AI to become that kind of smarter system in the loop.
Great. Okay, so we've got just a couple more minutes. We have a lot of new people who've never been to a FINOS call before. I posted 2 links. One's the blog referenced earlier around insights from the SEC, where you can hear a lot of the FINOS community talk about governance and emerging regulation. The second is calendar.finos.org. If you want to join any of our open source calls where we're talking about this, just search for AI on a couple of them. We have several calls sprinkled throughout the week. Closing out the call, and I'm going to merge these 2 questions. What do you think is the one thing financial institutions should do this quarter to better secure their AI stack? And are there any kind of tools and partnerships or resources you'd recommend in getting there?
I would have a real conversation with the people that are likely users of AI and say, declare AI amnesty. Tell me what you're using. Tell me what you're using personally. And we will do everything we can to make it possible for you to not have to do it personally. I think you will do so much more with that because it's too powerful to ignore and people are going to use it anyway. So use that as your first step.
I would and to that to say, do the same thing for your software development and data science teams. They're all pulling down models and using them and experimenting with them. I would say in the next quarter or 2, declare that amnesty, either ask or scan the code and say, hey, look, here are the models that are being used in development, like embedded into the code and the products that we're trying to go build, and start with that visibility and go into it with how are we going to help you use this, not how are we going to prevent it.
Excellent. Well, we are right at the top of the hour. A big thank you to Tyler and Aaron and Sonatype and Nvidia for joining us here today. This was, I think, an excellent panel. I think we could go on for another several hours of people's interests in Q&As, if only we had time permitting. As a reminder, this is a member benefit for FINOS, for the Open Source and Finance webinar series. We have another one upcoming, and unfortunately, I don't have that date handy. But if you keep track of our blog and sign up for our newsletters, we will be keeping people updated on socials. With that, big round of applause for Tyler and Aaron. Thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I took down plenty of notes from what you were saying, and I'm looking forward to how we can all work together on these issues going forward.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.